So after having a lot of success and getting a lot of feedback on part 1 and part 2 of used cars you should never buy, I decided to put together a part 3. So I want to mention a disclaimer again, just to clarify a few things before this video starts. So first off, I want to say that not every single car that I mention will have every single problem that I mention, and it might have other problems outside of what I mention. And it doesn't mean that these cars will even have problems, period, because I've gotten a lot of comments, most of them using colorful language to describe me, that have said, my car is blank and it's been great for me, you're wrong, basically is the gist of what they say. So I just want to say that that's great, and again, not every car will have every problem that I mentioned. So now that that's clear, let's go ahead and start off this list. So the first car on my list is the early 2000s Ford Explorer, and this car is known for being one of the least reliable cars ever produced. Transmission issues were extremely common with the Explorer, whether it be them failing at low mileage, issues with the overdrive, inability to shift, or rough shifts, period. The list goes on and on. Owners often cited the poor quality of the interior. All the plastic and stuff, all the door panels and stuff would often crack and rattle. There are also a few other minor problems with the Explorer, notably the wheel bearings failing and rear differential issues. So number 2 on my list is the late 90s and early 2000s Honda Accord. So I know that I'm going to take a lot of crap for putting this on here, but just hear me out. Because the automatic transmissions in these cars were quite horrible, especially when you compare them to the manuals. Most of the complaints on these Accords were related to the transmission, and those ranged from complete failure, being unable to shift properly, recurring slips, and more. Other issues with it were mainly electrical, specifically with the bad stereo, the CD player not working, or shortages on the dashboard. Number 3 on my list is the early and mid 2000s Ford Focus. From what I found, most of the issues related with the Ford Focus from these model years weren't related to the engine at all, but the interior instead. A lot of you might recall that I actually did a review on one of my friend's Ford Focuses. I believe it was a 2003 model, and he's only had the car a couple years, and it's been in the shop countless times for a variety of different issues. One of the most common issues with this car was the key getting stuck in the ignition, or the ignition just not working, period. And the engine and transmission did have some less common issues. The engine would sometimes shut off or stall while you were driving, and the automatic transmissions tended to slip and jerk a lot. Number 4 on the list is the mid and late 2000s Dodge Grand Caravan and Chrysler Town & Country. So both of these cars are nearly identical under the skin, so I'm just going to refer to both of them as the same thing. So in both models there were many interior and electrical issues, mainly the power locks failing. The brake pads and brake rotors were also god-awful. I mean, they would wear extremely fast, and the brakes weren't even good to begin with. The engine would also randomly stall while driving or just shut off completely, and in certain cases, oil use was excessive. Next on the list is the mid-2000s Nissan Pathfinder. The Pathfinder experienced some of the worst transmission problems out of any cars. Oddly enough, there was an extremely common issue with the coolant leaking onto the transmission, which probably led to most of the transmission-related problems, so I guess that's not entirely the transmission's fault. The transmission would often slip out of gear or fail completely. There's also a problem with the fuel gauge, as it would generally read very incorrectly, so that could be a bit sketchy if you don't really know how much fuel you have left in your tank, but I mean, it's really not that hard to keep track of. Number 6 on the list is the mid and late 2000s Ford Escape. The Escape was most commonly known for its transmission issues. Smaller issues with it, such as faulty transmission coolers, loss of certain gears, and rough shifts, ultimately led to these total transmission failures. Power steering malfunctions were also a major issue, to go along with a sticky gas pedal. Number 7 on the list is the Pontiac Aztek. and often noted as one of the ugliest cars ever produced, the Pontiac Aztek had more than just cosmetic issues in its short-lived production run between 2001 and 2005. There were a handful of electrical problems with the car. Just to name a few, there was the rear tailgate sometimes just would not open, and the car would sometimes lock itself shut. A couple other major issues included the AC and heater failing, which is very expensive to repair, and if you live out here in Arizona, you'll know how much of a pain that is to deal with. Number 8 on the list is the mid-2000s Dodge Durango. So the Durango had many issues regarding the engine. Owners most often complained of complete engine failures, sludge issues, random stalls, and more. The remote key was also ridden with issues, as it often completely broke or refused to work for no reason. The battery life on the Durango was also pretty bad, because sometimes the battery would drain itself while the car was off. Next on the list is the early and mid-2000s Nissan Altima, another car that I know I will take a lot of hate for, but once again, hear me out, because the Altima had a lot of the same transmission issues that previous cars on this list had as well. But outside of that, the steering wheel lock was a nagging problem. Only a few small issues existed besides these, most of them being electrical. For example, the push to start button would sometimes not work, or it would become completely unresponsive. So rounding out the list is the late 2000s and early 2010s Hyundai Elantra. So the Elantra had a few issues regarding the tires and wheels, specifically tire blowouts, premature tire wear, bubbles forming on the walls of the tire, and wheel bearing failures, just to name a few. The brakes were also extremely squeaky and made harsh noises. They also weren't very good brakes to begin with. The engine also had a few issues with it as well, whether it be things like ticking, shaking, complete failure, refusing to accelerate, or refusing to even start. So that's going to wrap up part 3 of this video. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you did, make sure to give this video a big thumbs up and leave your feedback down below in the comments, because I always like to read what you guys have to say. So thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you next video.
Go.